Hey guys, welcome back as we go over part two here of what we're referring to as a push some reforms, hence the progressive movement. We talked in the last video for a few minutes about who the progressives were. Again, a diverse coalition, mostly folks living in the middle class in the American cities. And they're concerned about a lot of what's going on. They're concerned about injustice, corruption, the power of large corporations, a drift away from morality. If you remember Victoria Woodhull that we talked about in the last unit, they're worried about a lot of these things and feel like that we can use the government, both at the state level, the local level, and the federal level, to be able to correct some of these. And as we move on, they have a lot of influences, and really the biggest influence that you see in doing so is the social gospel. If you remember the social gospel from our unit on urbanization, that's the idea that we have to take the tenets and teachings of Christianity and really take those to the streets to help with the poor. That could be a lot of what we're talking about with the settlement house workers, the Jane Addams, the Hull House, some of those where they were working together to try to improve the lives of folks living here in the city. They also were looking at this social gospel because of the influence it would have in giving a certain amount of honesty and decency in public life and in our public officials. Politicians who challenge this status quo, there's a lot, and they are on all sides of the political spectrum. In the Republican Party, you have people like Teddy Roosevelt being probably the most predominant and prominent of the reformers at that time. You're also looking as well people like William Jennings Bryan, who, as we all remember, gave the Cross of Gold tier. And we also have others, like at the state level. We have people like Fighting Robert La Follette. They called him Fighting Bob. He was the governor of Wisconsin who pioneered a lot of reform-minded ideas. And we'll talk a little bit more about them as we go along. But these progressives, again, other than the things uniting them, including that the government is the best way to fix the problem, one of the things that really they all committed to were the idea of democratic values. And I say that little d democratic, not the party. They believe that you should have honest and just laws, and that honest and just laws, if they're properly followed, will lead to a much better society. It'll improve the human condition, so to speak. Progressives, they tend to reject the la land, they would call it, of the transcendentalist. They don't look at everything with a romantic eye like the transcendentalists might. They start to look at things not the way they would, but basically not the way that they're dreamed about, but the way they actually are here and how we're going to fix those problems. So transcendentalism is rejected in favor of what we call pragmatism, where we start to test things and figure out what actually works best. Another thing that they really rejected was the idea that the American experiment was built on rugged individualism. They said in this day and age of large corporations and powerful organizations, we can't necessarily focus on the rugged individual anymore. We also need to get rid of what they refer to as laissez-faire capitalism, the idea that the government does not get involved. And remember, this is the idea that was dominant during the Gilded Age. The government doesn't get involved in the economy. And what we need to have is less of a hands-off and more of a protective hands-on approach by the government to solving a lot of the ills of the country. That's going to be, again, the ideas of pragmatism, the ideas of scientific management. If you recall from your reading, the gentleman that started the scientific management idea, he put folks on the factory floor and he timed them with a stopwatch. And he realized there were inefficiencies on the factory floor. And he began to think, if we can just bring in some managers, some guys who are trained in efficiency, we could increase output, we could do better work, and we would have to work faster and smarter instead of working harder. So we'll get into those a little bit more as well, but we'll highlight a few of the things as we go. You really, in order to be able to bring these ideas and to bring these progressive movement ideology to the forefront, you need to have something to make you mad, something to catch your attention. And in this time period, we started having these folks that would do the very same thing. These people were called muckrakers. And these muckrakers, and there were numerous ones of them, you're looking at people like, for instance, Lincoln Steffens, Ida Tarbell, Jacob Riis. These were journalists. And these journalists went out into the cities, into the factories, and these guys and ladies tried to expose all the filth and corruption in society. The word muck meaning filth, their job is to rake it up for everyone to see. And a lot of the times they did not give you any solutions to the problems. Their job was to simply go out and expose it, make you furious, and then here comes the government in to help fix the problem through various forms of legislation. How did they get their name? Again, they just raked it all up. They raked up the filth of society. That first major muckraking book, you can start talking about that, but one tends to be How the Other Half Lives by Jacob Riis. There's some others about Standard Oil that you read about in your book. In addition to some of those, you're really starting to see now more than anything else the rise of muckraking, almost tabloid magazines. And these tabloid magazines, for instance, are McClure's magazine, you're looking at Collier's magazine, and you're looking at Cosmopolitan. And these magazines, their job is to shock their readers, to show them all the inequity and the problems in society, and then energize those folks so they'll go out and advocate for social changes. For instance, Lincoln Steffens, Ida Tarbell, and Jacob Riis are all important writers of this time period. And as you start to look at their written works, you start to see a lot of influence that they had. Ida Tarbell especially, she will focus most of her fire on the Standard Oil Company and all of its abuses, and that will get her, in theory, in a lot of hot water, but it also enrages a lot of her readers who began to put a lot of pressure on the government to reform the Standard Oil. If you look here in your AMSCO book, it's on page 434, it gives you a really good discussion about that. Lincoln Steffens writes about the political machines. They called it Tweed Days in St. Louis, where they talked about the influence of the corrupt political parties and political machines in St. Louis. You also look at other books like Jacob Riis, How the Other Half Lives. Jacob Riis went into tenement homes and he went into factories and he started taking pictures of the absolutely squalid conditions in which some people lived and worked. We saw some of those pictures last week, especially the guys sleeping in the like 10-cent a night hotels, the guy that put his bed up between two barrels and slept on an old mattress, the kids that were sleeping over the grate. He took a lot of those pictures, and when he published those pictures, it began to really shock a lot of people, and it awakened their conscience to say, we need to do something to fix this. We can't allow our citizens to live in tenements anymore under such horrible, horrible conditions. The muckrakers, really, when you think about their long-range effect, they will eventually start to die out, primarily because it's hard to beat the next scandal and then top that next scandal and top that next scandal. But you start to see that they really did awaken a lot of the social consciousness and get people activated in terms of doing more to try to solve a lot of the societal problems. One little side note of this is you start to see businesses for the very first time invent the field of public relations. These businesses will start hiring what we call PR people to go out there and present the best side of the business. And part of the reason they do that and why we still have PR today is the tradition of the muckraking journalist. And we'll talk a little bit more about the actual reforms that they inspired in our next video.